Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third day of Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s fifth annual conference, dedicated this year to the 2020 elections and their domestic and global implications. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. I am pleased to welcome you all to this third and final day of the conference, focusing today on U.S. policy towards Palestine, Israel, and the impact of the 2020 elections on future policy decisions. We are happy today to have an excellent lineup of speakers to join us for this important discussion. Thanks to all our speakers and thanks to the viewers for joining in. We'll give a couple of seconds for people who are still joining in now. Before I introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, I would like to invite you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags ArabCenter2020 and Foreign Policy 2020. And please feel free to send in your questions at any time during the conversation. You can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, or you can send it by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So either the Q&A feature on Zoom or events@arabcenterdc.org. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Shibli Talhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is also a member of the Academic Advisory Board here at Arab Center Washington, D.C., and we're glad to have him. His research interests and expertise include U.S. policy in the Middle East, Arab politics, public opinion polling, and shifting political identities in the Arab world. In the past, he held several senior advisory positions at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, to Congressman Lee Hamilton, and as a member of the Iraq Study Group. Excuse me. He is widely published, and his best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, published in 2003, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books for that year. Thank you, Shibli, for being with us this morning. We are very pleased to have you join us to particularly discuss in the next 45 minutes or so, U.S. public opinion regarding policy towards Israel and Palestine and the implications for this year's presidential election. Dr. Talhami, you have been surveying public opinion on this issue in the United States for the last 30 years or so, I believe, looking at trends among Republicans, Democrats, and independents over time. We'd like to hear from you about some of your findings on U.S. public opinion, especially on issues like U.S. neutrality, U.S.-Israeli relations, the two-state solution and the one-state option, democracy in Israel, Israeli settlements, and recently, I believe you have some data on the BDS movement, among other things, of course. And today, I believe you're sharing with us new poll results, so we look forward to that. And I look forward to hearing your analysis and interpretations of all these data. Dr. Shibli Talhami, I will now turn the microphone over to you, please.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for organizing this. It's really an impressive panel to follow. I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues on this issue because we're all scratching our heads watching what's happening to our country and certainly to our foreign policy, especially toward the Middle East. Before I present you with some interesting new results from polling on where the American public is, let me just say a couple of things to put this in some perspective. I think, it's when you look at American policy toward Israel-Palestine, this has not been a strategic priority issue since the end of the Cold War, and certainly has not been a strategic priority for any American administration, including Obama's and Clinton's, in the last several decades, especially after the Arab uprisings and the Iraq War of 2003. It has been marginalized. There've been some diplomacy in some of which I was involved in, but it really was never a strategic priority in a way that compelled any major shift or taking risk for a president to do what might be needed to attain a just peace in the Middle East. So let's put that in perspective. And I would say that this particular administration, the Trump administration, is really an aberration, even with that. It's an aberration because in some ways it's an accident of history. It is where you have a president who knows very little about international affairs and cares very little about international affairs, who ignores all the experts, including his intelligence experts, and surrounded by a team to whom this issue, Israel-Palestine, is a priority ideological issue, where they can mobilize the president and the power of a superpower to implement an agenda as they see it, with little restraint from the system and with some applauding from the base. We're operating in a very polarized environment, so it's not useful particularly to talk about broad public opinion when it comes to an administration that mostly caters to a base. And obviously the base is at home with the policy that it has pursued in the Middle East. But let's be clear, when people specifically talk about the base pertaining to Israel-Palestine, people are speaking about evangelical Christians, about whom I'm writing a book. But I have done a lot of polling among evangelicals over the past 6 years. And let's be clear, they are not driving Israel-Palestine policy. They're applauding it. They don't really know what they want on policy. They're not the ones who particularly want to recognize the, for Israeli annexation over settlements in the West Bank. They're not the ones, and they would never abandon Trump if he did nothing on that issue, given that he's given them everything they want on every other issue, including, education and Supreme Court and tax breaks and so forth. They are not driving this policy. The team around him is driving the policy, and they are mobilizing the base, which is at home with supporting Israel. But again, they don't really know what to support in particular. They're mobilized as cheerleaders rather than as drivers of policy. And Trump would not lose them if he did nothing on this issue. And I showed in the past, even on the Jerusalem issue, that they were pretty much divided prior to Trump taking a position. Once he took a position, they applauded it. So let's be clear here too, that this is not the base, quote, driving this policy. It's the team around Trump driving this policy for ideological reasons and utilizing a base that is at home with that policy. So that's to be clear. But where is the public, both Republican and Democrats, where are they on this issue? And now I'm not going to go through all the stuff that I've done of 30 years of polling on this, but I just want to share a few slides to give you a little bit of a sense where Democrats and Republicans are, how they've shifted over the years, and particularly about the obvious gap in the Democratic Party between the constituency and the elected officials. But let me start with something more basic, which is let me just make sure I have the right. So I want to share something with you first, which is broad, related to where Americans, what American public priorities at the moment are. I just want to again remind you, not only is the Arab-Israeli issue not a priority for Americans right now, really no issue is. It's all about Trump and a referendum on the president. And this poll that we've done among 4,000 Americans in August during the two conventions compares even sort of the issues like the makeup of the Supreme Court, which we know is important when you ask people individually about how important it is. It's a very important issue for all Americans. And yet it's dwarfed by the Trump issue. You're either for Trump, a vote, look at among Democrats, it's mostly a vote against Trump and his agenda. Republicans, it's mostly for Trump and his agenda. Obviously, that includes issues, but it's really very personal. So clearly, this issue is not present in the election. And frankly, even after the election for a while, particularly if Joe Biden wins, it's certainly not for a while likely to be an issue that is going to jump to the priors, given all the mess that we find ourselves in that has to be addressed. But I just want to give you this baseline question that I have asked over the years for you to look at, and I just want to use this baseline question for a little bit more analysis. A lot of people say really not much has changed in public attitudes toward Israel-Palestine over the years. It's not true. I've been doing this for 30 years. What we used to see is that about 2/3 of Americans would say that they don't want the U.S. to lean toward Israel or toward the Palestinians. They want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. Now, if you look at this, this is the most recent poll. This is just the August poll. If you look at that, you'll see that, in fact, sorry, right here, you still have a large number of Americans, 62%, who want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. What has happened is it used to be that a majority of Republicans, almost 2/3, also wanted the U.S. to lean toward neither side. Now, 52%, and most of that comes from evangelicals, want the U.S. to lean directly toward Israel. And among Democrats, here's an interesting story. 74% want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. And then among those who want the U.S. to take side, look at the numbers. 13% want the U.S. to lean toward the Palestinians. 10% want the U.S. to lean toward Israel. Now, that Democrats are not anti-Israel. They just want fairness in dealing with this issue. And that has become clear in much of the debate. But the story here isn't just about this kind of polarization that has occurred on this issue, but it's highlighting the fact that I've started highlighting on most issues between the Democratic constituents and the elected officials. I wrote about it back in 2014, 2013, in some of the issues that were clear that the public was in a different place than elected Democratic officials. In this particular question, in this particular poll in August, I added a new question to see whether the public perceives their elected officials to be close to them or leaning more toward Israel than they are, or leaning toward the Palestinians more than they are. So the question was, compared with your view on this issue, how would you describe the positions of your elected congressional representatives on it? And they're more leaning toward Israel, more leaning toward the Palestinians, matching my positions, and then refuse to answer. So I want you to look at this. These are among the people who said they know where the position. There are over 40% who said they don't know where their elected officials are. But among those who knew where their elected officials, or they thought they knew where their elected officials are, look at the numbers. There are 60% say their elected congressional representatives were more leaning toward Israel than they are. That's self-perception of public, and 67% of Democrats say their elected officials are more leaning toward Israel than they are. And so you look at the matching my position, only 22% overall say matching my position. And the interesting thing is that holds for all. It holds for Republicans, it holds for independents, it holds for Democrats, it holds overall. So that's an interesting story here that we've all sensed, but now we know that even the constituents themselves realize that the representatives are somewhere other than where they are. Now, I also ask a set of questions related to Trump, policy versus where the public is, and you could see on the left, this is the position about where, in general, what role do you want the United States to play? Lean toward Israel, lean toward the Palestinians, lean toward neither side, and then on the right, you see assessing where Trump is, and again. Obviously, even Republicans perceive Trump to be leaning more toward Israel than they are. 65% say he's leaning toward Israel, where 52% want him to lean toward Israel. And that's certainly true across the board, particularly if you look at the bottom line number, 63 to 29. So there is a perception also even among Republicans that Trump is leaning toward Israel more than they are, and they want the US to lean toward Israel. Now, I want to move just substantively to two questions. I know Tamara had mentioned that I had done polling on also sanctions, and certainly the Democrats, by and large, are supportive of the idea of sanctions, particularly over settlements. We've seen that over time. But I want to change and just focus on a couple of issues that are broader here. And particularly now that we're talking about one state, two states, and what happens now as more and more people are concluding that it might be too late for a two-state solution. It is too late for a two-state solution. And where the American public is on this one. And I think that polling show that in essence, what we have is a kind of a values-based position of the American public. This is a question that I've asked for years, which is which of the following statement is closer to a view if a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an option. And I've found similar results in the past. This is the most recent one. And in a sense, it's one that comes after the Trump plan had been announced. So what we have here is look at the results. 65% of Americans, the bottom bar, the black bar, that's the total number of Americans. I favor Israel's democracy more than its Jewishness. I support a single democratic state in which Arabs and Jews are equal, even if that means Israel would no longer be a politically Jewish state. Versus, I favor the Jewishness of Israel more than its democracy. I support the continuation of Israel's Jewish majority in the government, even if it means that Palestinians will not have citizenship and full rights. Now you see the gap here. It's a huge gap, but what's interesting about it is not just the total, but also Republicans. Now obviously the gap among Republicans is a little bit narrower than with the rest of the population, but you could see 51% still say they favor Israel's democracy over Jewishness, where 37% say they favor Israel's Jewishness over democracy. I think that's a particularly important issue to keep in mind, because as more people conclude that maybe two states is not viable anymore, the question will be about this. It's a value issue, and I think that there is, you could see, particularly for Democrats, 78% say they favor a democracy over Jewishness. Only 12% say they favor democracy over Jewishness. That's particularly telling, and I think we're in a way moving more toward this kind of debate within the Democratic Party, certainly the Democratic constituency, if in fact, depending obviously what politicians put on the table and where that conversation heads on one state versus two state. I also want to point out that with regard to the domestic environment, again, this is a values issue that goes way beyond BDS or sanctions or criticism of Israel. We saw that in a way, that debate reflecting itself even in the platform, which was relatively moderate, meaning not quite accommodating of the progressives in the Democratic Party, and I say that in quotation mark. So you have here a question for Democrats that goes way beyond the question of Israel-Palestine. And I have written before, I've argued in articles showing that Israel-Palestine, for a large number of Americans, especially Democrats, isn't so much about I like Israel or don't like Israel, I like the Arabs and don't like the Arabs, I love the Palestinians or don't love the Palestinians. It is about a worldview. It is about a set of values of human rights, democracy, international law, equity, civil rights at home. Those are the issues, and Israel-Palestine had become a prototype for a large number of Americans, especially Democrats. And you can see that in the public discourse that we have. But on this particular issue here, that I will end with as the last example, say in the midterm election, several members of the House of Representatives were elected who have been vocally critical of the Israeli government policies and of American support for Israel, regardless of whether you agree with their specific criticism or whether or not you back American support for Israel. Tell me which of the following is closer to your view. Now, I want you to think about this, because this is really, for a lot of people, what it's about. It's not so much like and dislike. Keep in mind that the very people who criticize the Israeli government and its right-wing policies and occupation also criticize Arab rulers for violations of human rights. So this isn't about a choice. This is about a position that is values-based that people take. And on this one, you can look and see, very few people say it's unacceptable for a member of the US Congress to question the Israeli-American relationship, as one member of Congress had suggested. That's true of all, only 12% of Republicans agree with this position, a very consistent position. And then it is a duty of a member of US Congress to defend the Israeli-American relationship. Well, okay, so there are 32% of Republicans who actually believe that or say that. But look at the Democrats' independents and overall numbers, 19%. Where most people are is the last two categories. It is acceptable for a member of Congress to question the Israeli-American relationship. 43% say that. You can see it's very close among Republicans and Democrats on this one. And on the last category, juxtaposed to it's a duty of a member to defend the the Israeli-American relationship, here is a duty of a member to question the Israeli-American relations. Here you have a quarter of American public saying it is a duty to question it, and 35% Democrats, 1/3 of Democrats who say that. And that tells you something about where a lot of the grassroots Democrats are on this issue. And so the question now for us, and I'd love to hear what the panel has to say, is whether or not this really is going to be consequential if Trump gets elected for US policy. And I'll say just a couple of quick things. Number one, on the big issue, which is moving the Israeli-Palestinian issue towards some just resolution, no, not immediately for sure, because there's so much on the agenda of the next president, given the mess we're in right now. This issue is not a strategic priority, and I don't expect any administration, regardless of where the public is on it, to be particularly focused or spend a lot of leverage on this issue. Having said that, I do think that there will be some meaningful steps that will take place because we've seen where the public is on annexation, particularly Democrats. If Biden gets elected, that would become a red line for a Biden administration. We are likely to see a renewal of aid to the Palestinians, particularly humanitarian aid. We're likely to see a variety of things at the United Nations that would be different, but I do not expect that any new administration, including a Biden administration, would put more energy into it than Obama did and failed. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, Shibli, for this. I have just a couple of follow-up questions, and we're getting a few questions in here, so I'll get back to I'll get to those in the next minute. But you've mentioned a little bit about this shift in American public opinion, and to some extent, the Democratic Party leadership is in line with Democrats with regard to annexation and a few other things, relationship with the Palestinians, but they are not when it comes to sanctions, for example, conditioning aid to Israel, which has been one of the issues that has been coming up recently regarding, preferring a democratic Israel over a Jewish Israel. Do you think there's going to be any push or pressure on a Biden administration from the Democratic constituents, but also from the new members of Congress that are expected to be elected this year, and the Bernie Sanders kind of progressive wing of the party? Do you think there will be any influence?
Yeah. First, let's keep in mind that even people who've been critical of Israel, with the exception of some progressives who have been more vocal on this, but people like Senator Chris Von Hollen, who had taken a bold position, given that he's so mainstream senator who is highly respected and has worked with Republicans as well as Democrats. When you look at his position, he tied it really to A, non-security related aid, and B, only if Israel were to annex. So I think the conditionality with annexing, I think, will remain. I think we'll be more vocal about that. So people will will at least raise the question of tying aid to Israel to annexation as a way of preventing it from happening. I don't think that you're going to see a push to impose sanctions over policies that are not related to annexation in the short term. I do think, though, and it's important that you raise the question about the newly elected members of Congress. We know that there will be some new progressives coming in. We know that because they won their primaries and in heavily Democratic districts, and there will be more. And I think that's really an important point, where even though the Israel-Palestine question has not been a priority issue strategically for the U.S., so therefore, once you enter a general election or a policy realm for a president, it's not going to be a top priority issue over which a president is going to bat in a way that he would on, let's say, the Iran nuclear deal, as Obama did, versus Israel-Palestine. And nonetheless, in Democratic politics, this issue resonates. We've seen that in the primaries. And so in the primaries, there's no question that people who criticized a pro-right-wing policy in Israel actually were rewarded mostly by their constituents. Not only did they not pay a price, but this wasn't a weapon they can use in their favor. And that has been, like against, Congressman Engel, who's obviously a veteran, important member of Congress. So clearly in Democratic politics, it's going to be still the case. And I do think that more voices in Congress does put pressure. When you bring even one or two people to the table, it does create a different dynamic within the Democratic Party, just as we've seen even with the Democratic competition for replacing Engel as a chair of the committee. Name one member who didn't criticize Israeli annexation. Even people who had been counted to be pro-Israel prior to that voiced support for the possibility of linking aid to possible annexation. So there is a dynamic change. It shouldn't be underestimated. It is growing, but it's not going to have an impact in the short term in a way that is going to alter the big picture in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, Shibli, for that. Just a very quick follow-up. How do you explain that change? Is it, values-based, like you said, entirely, or does it have anything to do with, generational differences, or, what some people call the Bernie Sanders effect, or the proliferation of the internet and social media? How do you explain these changes?
Well, there are several factors. One factor is that we've had a very right-wing Israeli government in office for so long that it has and has been not only a right-wing Israeli government, but a government that has been at odds with Democrats, that has played in American politics during the Obama administration, and certainly the Trump administration, associated itself with Republicans more, with this Republican President Trump, took a position against President Obama, seemed to certainly weighed in, or apparently weighed in the election campaign in favor of Trump, or reportedly has. And so all of this stuff obviously alienated Democrats. No question that that's part of it. Number two, we are very polarized, and in that polarization, we are focused on values, and this sharpens the values issue. For me, I'm voting, in November. I already have my ballot actually ordered by mail, what am I voting for? I'm certainly not focused on Israel-Palestine. I'm not focused on any issue. I'm focused on, this is about our democracy. This is about our values. This is about our human rights. This is about civil rights. It's about equality. And it's sharpened that. And in that context, it does put the Palestinian question very squarely in the center of it, because I think the biggest asset for the Palestinians is this question of fitting into a broader values: international law, human rights, equality, justice, the kind of package that occurs. And third, there is no question that there has been a demographic shift. The segments of the Democratic Party that have expanded, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, women, Asian Americans, younger people, all have exhibited more fairness toward Israel-Palestine. I don't say anti-Israel because there's not really an anti-Israel sentiment. That's the wrong way to say it. It's anti-right-wing Israeli policy. It's anti-occupation. It's not anti-Israel. It's not pro-Arab, because obviously the same people, as I keep repeating, criticize Arab authoritarians. It's not about, and may not even like Mahmoud Abbas either. It's not the point about the leadership. It's about the values. And those segments of the Democratic Party have expanded and continuing to expand and shifting it in that direction.
Thank you for that. We have quite a few questions, so I'll read some of them and try to get to as many as we can. You stated that, I'm just reading here, you stated that the Israel-Palestine question has not been a strategic priority for the US, yet it is a priority for the Trump administration and the Middle East team at the White House.
Yeah, and that's what I said. I started by saying it is a priority for this administration because it's an aberration of history, an accident of history. And it's an accident because you have a president who himself doesn't really follow specific issues, doesn't know much about international affairs. I'm not really sure he knows much about what the occupation means or annexation means, or all of these issues. And this, I'm not saying off the top of my head. Obviously, it's been in the memoirs of people who work with him. I'm also co-authoring a book about the Trump and Obama administrations, have interviewed many of Trump's top aides on this issue. Clearly, this is not somebody who follows specifics, and he doesn't consult with experts or intelligence or bureaucrats. And so he's essentially given his team, principally his son-in-law and his ambassador to Israel, who is this former bankruptcy lawyer, free hand. and they have been able to mobilize his support to utilize the base that is already supportive of Israel, and mobilize the weight of the superpower, to twist arms, to bring resources to bear, to offer millions to people to normalize, to billions in some cases, reportedly in the case of the Sudan, or hundreds of billions in the case, hundreds of millions in the case of the Sudan, that's unusual. Sure, domestic politics has increased as a factor since the end of the Cold War because the strategic imperatives have been lowered, but never have we seen anything like that, where this issue rises in the priority because of its ideological importance to a subgroup within the White House, and a president who is essentially not paying all that much attention on the specifics. So yes, this is true. It's unpredictable. It's unlikely to repeat itself. But it's like so much that has happened on the watch of this administration.
And you mentioned the normalization deals. We have a couple of questions. Has the Israeli agreement with the UAE and Bahrain improved Trump's chances of re-election? And you've mentioned a little bit about the priority issues, but if you could touch on that a little bit.
No, I don't. And here's, I think that, look, if I am a Jared Kushner, I want this normalization deal, not because it's going to help the president get reelected. I want it because I want normalization between Israel and the Arab states. And I know that Trump may not get reelected in November, and I want it done now. But if I was going to go to my president and tell him, look, I want you to support this. I want you to allow me to use our resources and muscle. I want you to make phone calls. I want to tell him that this is going to help you electorally. And I want to also get the evangelicals to repeat that message to him. But the bottom line is, no, I don't think it's going to help him or it's going to hurt him. I just don't think it's going to matter. I don't think people care about, what they don't necessarily object to peace. In fact, Democrats don't object to peace between Israel and the Arab states. They've been, been pushing for it even without Israel-Palestine movement. They sometimes say, oh, you got to extract more for it from the Israelis, but that's about it. They're not going to oppose it. But is this not, who's going to, at this point, when I showed you the Supreme Court, okay, the Supreme Court, which obviously is far more important than Israel-Palestine for Americans right now. One of the most important issues, maybe in addition to healthcare, to Americans right now. And it's dwarfed by the extent to which this is a referendum about Trump. And so I don't think his base is suddenly going to support him more because of it. I don't think anybody is going to oppose him more because of it. I think it really doesn't make much difference.
And we have a somewhat related question about focusing on the Arab world in this case. The questioner asks, the Arab world is unanimous about the two-state solution. Do the two-state solution and the Abraham Accords, as they are known, serve conflicting or mutual interests I'm guessing, for the Arab countries?
Well, the thing about the two-state solution, let's just think about it a little bit conceptually, not just for Arabs or but for Americans as well, actually. It has been kind of a comfort position to take, a psychological fig leaf, I would say, for people to take, because if they don't support two states, what are they going to support? That's the problem. So I showed you where Americans are. So if there's no two states, and they'll support a democratic state with equal citizenship. When American politicians going to say, I don't want a Jewish state right now? Nobody wants to be in that position. In the Arab world, if you say no two states, where do you go? What is it that you're going to say? Well, sure, you can say you want equality for Palestinians, but what if they don't? If it doesn't happen? So I think the problem is even bigger than that because, and it reflects itself in some ways in the position of the Palestinians themselves, particularly the Palestinian Authority, because frankly, the biggest asset for the Palestinians is still international legitimacy of their cause. International law, UN resolutions, prior agreements, issues of justice and equality. Those are the things that really are still the assets for the Palestinians. Well, the fact is the UN resolutions are all for two states in recent years. The fact is that's where the European Union is. The fact is that's where the international community is. So if you abandon that, you're abandoning in some ways where part of the basis for your legitimacy is. So it's really a complicated issue pertaining to the actual agreement between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain. I happen to think that it doesn't really change the picture much. It hurts the Palestinians obviously more than it helps them. That's obvious because obviously part of the argument for has been that that card of normalization should be used in order to get Israel to make concessions. And obviously it's not right now. So clearly it plays into that argument that Israel can make peace without it. But the honest truth is that card had never been effective. I mean, the Arab states have put it on the table. We're not nearer to a two-state solution. Even if there had been no peace between Israel and the UAE, no peace between Israel and Bahrain, we're not going to be closer to a two-state solution. So now, obviously, it might lead more people to say two states are not viable, and that takes you into the values kind of conversation that is separate from one state versus two states.
Let me just unmute myself. We have a set of questions that I'll end with here because we're reaching the end of our time, but we have quite a few questions about the demographics of your sample. They're asking about males, females, religion. Have you compared the responses of Jewish Americans to those of the overall population? Which states did you pull the sample from? If you could briefly, in maybe 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. That's a good one. So all our polls are done with Nielsen Scarborough. They have a probabilistic online panel. And we have a nationally representative sample from that panel that is also weighted demographically to reflect the national distribution based on census data. In this particular case, it was a huge, the biggest poll that we have done, which is almost 4,000 Americans, nationally representative sample of nearly 4,000 Americans. Of course, we do a lot of demographic analysis, and you can actually see some of that online and in articles, and they're extremely important. With religion, as you might imagine, evangelicals by far are the most, the group that wants Israel, the US to lean toward Israel the most, and is more comfortable with annexation than other segments of the public. When it comes to other demographics, Hispanics and African Americans, young people and women tend to be more than other groups wanting the US to lean toward neither side. And in some cases, the minority who want the US to take sides more tend to want now Israel, the US to lean toward the Palestinians. A very small number. I displayed some of that over the whole because I think the overwhelming majority, certainly among Democrats and nearly 2/3 of all Americans, want the US to take neither side. But just as you might expect, the constituents that make up the Democratic Party tend to want the US to be even-handed far more than the rest of the population.
Thank you. And let me squeeze in one final question here from the viewers. Do you see any promising openings for Palestinian initiatives in the present circumstances of low strategic importance of the issue but at the same time, broad support in US public opinion for a democratic over a Jewish state in Israel.
Well, that's a big issue, and I'm not going to take just in a few seconds to say more about it. But I want to say a few things here. I mean, obviously there's been a Palestinian failure separate from the Palestinian cause has paid a price, and it's a failure that is not, by the way, in opposing the Trump plan. I don't see how any Palestinians could have supported the Trump plan or worked with Trump after they decided to move to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I just don't see that. I don't. It doesn't matter whether it's Mahmoud Abbas or anybody else. That's not a failure of the Palestinians. The failure was basically to, if you're not going to work with the administration, to shore up your support elsewhere. And obviously, the principal support historically for the Palestinians emanated from the Arab world. That's why even the rest of the world thinks of it as strategically important, because they think it still resonates with other Arabs and even Muslims beyond the Arab world. And if you don't shore up your support there, if you don't find a way to work with people, even people you don't like or people you disagree with, and reach out to create a coalition, I think you're doing something wrong, because obviously it's going to come back to hurt you. And that is a realization that we see now. And don't take public opinion in the Arab world for granted either, even though I believe it remains supportive of the Palestinians. But I think that's really the biggest failure. And I think that's one that has to be revisited. And that's where the issue of, looking for opportunity should start.
Thank you, Shibli. We've reached the end of our time for this particular segment of today's program. Thank you very much, Shibli, for your time and for your insights. And thanks to everyone for joining in and sending your questions. I would like to ask the viewers to stay with us as we move to the next panel in the next few seconds here. And now I will turn over the microphone to my colleague, Yusuf Munayyer, who will chair the next panel discussion titled The Arab-Israeli Conflict Between Trump and Biden. Yusuf?
All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Yusuf Munayyer. I'm a non-resident fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I am pleased to welcome you to ACW's 5th annual conference and to this panel this morning, the Arab-Israeli conflict between Trump and Biden. And let me just thank also Shibli for his remarks, which I think have provided us with some really great context to carry on with our conversation today. We have with us this morning 4 exceptional panelists who scarcely need introducing. They will examine U.S. policy toward Palestine and Israel and the impact of the 2020 election on future policy decisions. I'll introduce each of them briefly in alphabetical order. Peter Beinart is professor of journalism at Newmark Graduate School of Journalism and professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. Peter is also a contributor to The Atlantic, a columnist for Jewish Currents, and a CNN political commentator. He's published books and has written for numerous U.S. and international periodicals. His most recent book, The Crisis of Zionism, was published by Times Books in 2012. Laura Friedman is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Prior to joining FMEP, Laura served in senior Middle East related positions, including at Americans for Peace Now and at the State Department. She is an authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and is regularly consulted by the media and policymakers and their staff, both in the United States and internationally. She's published widely in the press and is a contributing writer at Jewish Currents and a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Middle East Project. Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focus is on Palestine-Israel peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and U.S. foreign policy in the region. Previously, she was the coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership. She regularly participates in Track to Peace efforts and is a contributor to The Hill and Haaretz, and her commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, Salon, Al Jazeera English, CNN, and others. And Rashid Khalidi is perhaps the foremost U.S. historian on the Middle East. He is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, editor of the Journal for Palestine Studies, and co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies. He's the recipient of numerous awards and author of almost a dozen books, including his most recent, The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. Many thanks to all four of you for joining us today. Really stellar panel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Before we jump into that, though, I would like to invite the audience to submit questions to the panel using the Q&A feature here on the Zoom video call, or via email by sending your email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Please also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags #ArabCenter2020 and #ForumPolicy2020. So I have asked each of our panelists to sort of provide us with some introductory remarks on a couple of different areas of focus within this topic. I'd like to begin with Rashid, if we could. Rashid, I'm hoping you can give us sort of a broad historical perspective on this moment and what it means for Palestinians. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Yusuf, and thanks to the Arab Center for organizing this. It's very timely, and I'm glad you have so many people attending. I think that the moment that we're in during this presidential campaign is also a climactic moment in terms of the way the Palestine issue is treated in the United States. I think we're seeing some really important seismic shifts. Shibli Talhami's talk that we just all listened to, or most of us listened to, talked about what I think are fundamental shifts in American public opinion that are ongoing, and that I think will increase, because I think they're linked to demographic trends, and I think they're linked to big changes among younger people. At the same time, we're seeing in the Middle East really quite striking events that the United States, I think, has precipitated to some extent. I think that the process of normalization between unrepresentative dictatorial Arab regimes and Israel is an important phenomenon. And I think it probably will increase the fragility of those regimes over time. I think it will further isolate Israel in certain respects over time, but strategically, it's a big defeat for the Palestinians in many respects, I think. And this is partly a function of their failures. That this was mentioned in the last part of the panel. The failure to put forward a peace plan, the failure to build up alliances, the failure to clearly state what the Palestinians want, the failure to have a clear strategy. But it's also a function of the weakness of most of these Arab, unrepresentative, undemocratic, repressive Arab regimes, which are the ones that are rushing towards normalization. Where there is any form of democracy, or where public opinion has any element in governance in the Arab world, you do not see governments doing what the Emirates government or the Bahraini government have done. Now, why do I say that some important changes are taking place? I think that the polling that Shibli Talhami just exposed for us, that he did as recently as last month, is an indication that American public opinion, and I think with a great lag time eventually, American politics, and with a further lag time, American policy, are actually going to begin to change. I think that one of the reasons for this is the most intransigent, aggressive, expansionist, racist Israeli government in the history of Israel. And that's saying a lot. I mean, to hit the top on all of those metrics is remarkable. And that has alienated even many people who are very supportive of Israel. And we saw that with the issue of annexation. Now, annexation, as it turns out, was a red herring. Annexation has been ongoing since the moment Israeli troops stepped into the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. And it is an ongoing process. It will continue. And the brouhaha about it was partially artificial. It was to some extent initiated by the Trump plan and Netanyahu's reception of that plan. But the changes I'm talking about, I think, are really significant in that, as was mentioned in the last panel, we now have a group of congresspeople, congressmen and congresswomen. There are going to be many, many more of them as of the next Congress in January, who are not afraid to be harshly critical of Israel, or at least of Israeli policies, and who are much more supportive of Palestinian rights. This never happened in American history. There never was a bloc in Congress which said things like Israel should stop imprisoning children, or we should make aid to Israel conditional on anything. The idea of conditionality never occurred. The only question was, how much more, how high should we jump? How much more, how high should we jump? It's now, there's a different debate going on. I agree that we're not going to have conditions on aid to Israel. We're very unlikely to have that. I agree that that bloc will not have much impact in the next Congress, but it's there and it is very important. Now, why are these changes taking place? I think that there is a real sea change among young people in this country where this issue is concerned. We just had a divestment referendum on the Columbia campus. The results were announced yesterday. New York City is where the Biltmore Declaration was announced in 1942. New York City is the city with the largest Jewish population on the planet. New York City is a city where you would assume if there is support for an intransigent Israeli position or for any Israeli position, you would find it to be very strong. In a divestment referendum at Columbia, the vote was 61% in favor of Columbia divesting from companies that support the occupation and 27% against. Over 1,000 students voted for divestment at Columbia. The same kind of vote was seen at Brown, the same kind of vote last year. 2 years ago, the same kind of vote was seen at Barnard, which is a part of Columbia. So I think we are seeing something really quite remarkable, at least on American campuses, among young people in the Jewish community, among young people from other communities. And there's a fashionable term, intersectionality. Well, it actually has real meaning because the coalition that put together this divestment platform included groups all across the campus of every color, stripe, race, background, ethnicity, orientation, and so forth. And that kind of thing is really, really important among young people. And I doubt that that's going to change for the worse as far as this issue is concerned. I think it's going to change for the better. And I think it's a function of the fact that a lot of these kids, a lot of these young people are not hooked on the mainstream corporate media. They get their news from other sources, all kinds of other sources, much more varied sources. And they know that much of what they're told in the mainstream media, which essentially repeats a narrative that is false and which we've been fed for generations, is unreliable. They know it's unreliable on other issues, and they know it's unreliable on this. I think another thing that we should take into account is the fact that historically speaking, the Israel lobby has had a certain amount of power, but it's amplified that power by taking a few cases and saying, you see, if you oppose Israel on this issue, we will defeat you. Well, that's happened in a few cases. Chuck Percy, you could go back and cherry pick a couple of cases. It's not happening anymore. In the 16th congressional district here in New York, the margin was enormous, whereby Jamal Bowman defeated Elliot Engel. Now, I don't think Palestine was the reason Engel was defeated. It was one of many, many reasons. But Jamal Bowman was explicitly favorable to a much more critical position on Israel. The same thing happened with Mondaire Jones in New York's 17th district, where he defeated somebody who was very supportive of Israel. The same thing happened in the Illinois 3rd Congressional District, where Marie Newman publicly said, I am in favor of conditionality as far as annexation is concerned. And she openly courted the Palestinian community in that district. It's a suburban district, southern part of Chicago and down into the suburbs. So you're going to have three more. Those are only three of many more people who are going to enter Congress and whom the lobby tried to defeat or tried to help defeat and completely failed. So I think that the terror which stalked the halls of Congress when people were told, if you don't vote with Israel, if you don't take the paper that we gave you and do exactly what we say exactly what we say, or you'll be defeated, that terror has diminished, at least in the Democratic Party. Now, historically speaking, I think that we have a situation that really hasn't changed. I think the United States has fundamentally opposed Palestinian sovereignty, statehood, independence, self-determination for many, many years, since 1978, the Camp David Accords. And I think that the fact that the United States is a dishonest broker is now apparent to a lot of people. I think the polls that Shibli put forward, the polling that he put forward in an earlier segment indicates that. I think that might have actually penetrated the thick skulls of some parts of the Palestinian leadership who have been unwilling to accept that you have to go to a completely different approach. It's not enough by any means, but the idea of the United States as the essential actor here is, I think, finally fading in the Arab world. It's an illusion that Anwar Sadat fostered, that many other Arab rulers fostered, that the rulers of the Gulf continue to foster. But I don't think they think the United States is an honest broker. I think they think the United States will protect their fragile thrones from their people and from other countries. That's why the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized with Israel. They want Israel and the United States to protect them against their own people and against challenges like Iran. So I think that sooner than we might have expected, the United States, I don't think the United States is going to change course under Biden. It's going to continue to be pro-Israel. The leadership of the Democratic Party has not changed. The people in their 60s and 70s who lead the Democratic Party, control the money, control the party machine, are as pro-Israel as they ever were. They'll shade that a little bit. That's not going to change. American policy will continue to be fundamentally anti-Palestinian. It will not support Palestinian rights. But the gap between that and where the demography is going, where the youth are going, where the Democratic Party itself is going, where an increasing number of people in Congress are going, is sooner or later, I think, going to have an effect. And I think that other people in the world, Palestinians, Arabs, others in the world, are going to realize that the United States has basically ruled itself out as a mediator, ruled itself out as a constructive actor. I don't think that the policies of the Obama administration or the policies of what I expect the Biden administration, if should be elected, are gonna change that. I am not a person who says the United States is declining. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm saying the United States, by its blind one-sided policy under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has ruled itself out as the central player in any attempt to achieve a just solution to this problem. I don't think we will necessarily see one during the Biden administration, but I think we're seeing a trend historically, which is positive, which is more and more Americans realize the United States has not been playing a constructive role. And let me stop there.
Thank you so much for all of that, Rashid. I want to turn now to Laura, if we could. Laura is one of the most astute Congress watchers on Israel-Palestine matters. And Laura, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in particular on Congress, in particular, the sort of legislative initiatives on Israel-Palestine that have shaped the Trump period, and what we might expect, if we have a Trump victory or a Biden victory when it comes to legislation in Congress, and also something that I know that you think about a lot, that many people may not focus on very much, is the impact of the legislation that has been passed during the Trump administration, and the effect that that's still going to have moving forward, regardless to who might win in November. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Laura.
Thanks, Yusuf. And Thanks for having this event today and for hosting this great panel. It's an honor to be part of this esteemed crew. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. And if people have questions, I guess we can get back to that in the Q&A. I think thinking about Congress, the first thing I'd say is that if anyone, people who are present for Shibley's presentation that started us off today, if you look at Congress, what you see is that Congress is very much out of step with what Shibley is finding in his polls about how American voters actually feel. In terms of the traditional role of Congress and then looking at that compared to the Trump era, it's actually an interesting story because traditionally Congress, and this is bipartisan, has played a role. If you look back over the past 25 years or so, or since the peace process for sure, they've pretty much played the role of being the party that either pushes a White House, again, regardless of what party's in the White House, to be more pro-Israel, right? To move the embassy, to recognize the Golan, to punish the Palestinians for being bad, to clamp down on UNRWA, whatever. Or it's the party that condemns the White House for things that they're doing vis-a-vis the peace process that they consider, not pro-Israel enough or problematic, like actions at the UN, or, again, failing to move the embassy or failing to sanction the Palestinians and the mission in Washington. So you look back at the history of peace process or Israel-Palestine focused legislation, that's the role Congress has always played, because it's always been the White House that's been leading. Whether you think they're doing it effectively or ineffectively, I think history would show it's always been pretty ineffective, but it's been Congress acting as a rein on the things that are trying to move the situation forward towards peace and trying to light a fire under a White House to be more, I would actually argue, anti-Palestinian and pro-Israel. With Trump, the script was flipped from the get-go, because Trump came in with an agenda that pretty much embraced every far, I would call right wing, but it's bipartisan, everything Congress has ever been pushing an administration to do to the Palestinians, he did it on his own, right? So closing the PLO mission, moving the embassy, recognizing the Golan, clamping down on aid to the Palestinians, reframing the relationship with UNRWA and essentially saying most Palestinian refugees aren't refugees. He did that on his own. To the extent that Congress did act, I would point out, for instance, on Jerusalem, or on the PLO mission, when the president declined to give the waiver that allows the PLO mission to exist in Washington, he then let the PLO mission stay open for months and months in defiance of law. It's hard to imagine that a Congress would have permitted any other president to defy US law and effectively let the presidents the Palestinians against US law remain in the US. But because Trump is seen, and this is again, bipartisan patience for him, as the true pro-Israel position or whatever, no one wants to challenge him on that. It was amazing as a Congress watcher watching Congress stay silent as the PLO was allowed to stay in Washington all those months when law said they should have been thrown out because there was no waiver. The places where Congress really did set an agenda or go beyond Trump are also interesting. A key piece of legislation that passed under Trump was the Taylor Force Act, which is the piece of law that pretty much says that all US aid to the Palestinians has to stop because of the pay to slay, because Palestinians pay this funding to the families of people who've been killed or jailed by Israel. But let's remember, Taylor Force was already on its way to passing before Trump came into office. It was bipartisan, so this was already there. This is not an artifact of the Trump era. The two things that are more artifacts of the Trump era are things that go beyond Trump policy, which are, to get into really annoying language, ATCA and the URA Act. These are two pieces of legislation that are really designed to let the US, to let private citizens sue the PA, the PLO, or other terrorist organizations, if you call them terrorist organizations, out of existence by private citizens. And the other piece of it is aid. And I know that Rashid just talked about this. The main thing that Congress did in this era, and this is again bipartisan with Republicans standing with Trump in his very pro-Israel position, and Democrats trying to prove they're even more pro-Israel than Republicans, is we have an aid bonanza over the past 4 years. And then aid bonanza really comes together in what is now being considered by Congress, which is the NDAA, which may or may not be passed before the election. But this is a huge bill that it represents. I mean, it is a codification of the MOU, right? The Memorandum of Understanding to ensure that nobody ever puts any conditions on aid. And this has again got bipartisan support. It has new funding for programs across the board. It gives Israel a role, a cabinet level role in a role in cabinet level discussions on U.S. military planning. I mean, the breadth of what is given to Israel in this bill is breathtaking. And this is all happening in the context of Israel, again, as people have said previously, very hardline government that is on the edge of formal annexation and moving ahead with de facto annexation. So that's sort of where it stands. Where things didn't happen under Congress, where they didn't move, I think actually does speak to some of the dynamics in the grassroots, the broader political dynamics that are in play here. There are three major pieces of legislation that didn't pass in this Congress. One is the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, and the Combating BDS Act. And what these three acts have in common is that they're all brazenly supporting policies that are unconstitutional. They're all about quashing free speech in the name of protecting Israel from criticism or in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, but they're all about quashing free speech critical of Israel. On the one of them, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, the president moved on his own and did this by executive order, so it's sort of overtaken by events. But on the other two, it really is interesting. These are pieces of legislation that AIPAC and others have been trying to get Congress to pass for years, and they hit a wall here with Democrats in the House, mainly not because I think leadership in the House is so progressive, but because this was understood it was going to be such an ugly fight already. That's before we had the primaries, which are going to bring in next year even more progressive members. We already had something of a break, at least on these worst pieces. It'll be interesting to see how that moves in the next round. So in that sense, I think the ground has actually already shifted a little bit. That is a break on maybe the worst things. People have also spoken about, we are seeing for the first time some weak and limited support for conditioning aid to Israel, or for at least having a conversation about conditioning aid to Israel, which was absolutely impossible in the past. And we're actually seeing some open and active criticism of a potential Israeli policy, although it does feel more like people are criticizing the word annexation more than they're criticizing the actual policy of annexation, which is not fabulous. But things are going to be changing in the next Congress. We're going to see some of the old guard departing. Engel lost, Lowy's retiring. I mean, that's a big deal, and others. The race to succeed Engel as the chair of HVAC has been really interesting. It started out, I think, a little more encouraging, but at this point we have one member, Sherman, who's running again as the more pro-Israel candidate. You should bring me on because the other two aren't pro-Israel enough, but it's still a significant change. And then we have the victory of challengers at the grassroots who came in, none of them, if you look at Jamal Bowman or Cori Bush, these are not primaries that were about Israel, but forces that want to ensure a status quo hardline position in the Democratic Party. They did enter these primaries and try to make it about Israel in order to defeat these progressive challengers, and they failed. And that sends a really powerful message, I think, to members of Congress. And I think it sends, to the extent that there are progressives in Congress who until now have been perhaps reluctant to come out as progressive as they might be, there I think is some hope that the next election, that the next House in particular, you will see more backbone, because it's at this point the Democrats, the progressive caucus is more of possibly the majority of the Democrats in the House. So it's going to be really interesting. The bottom line though is, whether I agree with Rashid, I don't think a Biden victory is going to change US policy on Israel significantly. I think fundamentally it'll be an effort to roll it back to the highly successful, I say that with sarcasm, policy of the Obama administration. But either Trump or Biden, I mean, I can't say that Trump, whether he actually cares about what Congress does or rule of law, but if one does assume that we still have a separation of powers and legislative power, I think it is going to be a more interesting situation next year where you potentially have more progressives willing to hold the line, particularly on constitutional matters, because the Israel-Palestine issue is now being fought about on the Hill as a constitutional matter. Is it going to be made law in the US that it is anti-Semitic and therefore a violation of the Civil Rights Act, whatever, to criticize Israel? And is it going to be made a matter of law that a person, as a personal matter, choosing to boycott Israel settlements is engaged in an illegal boycott or an anti-Semitism? So this is going to, I think, be where sort of the rubber hits the road when it comes to the grassroots meeting the political echelons. The last piece I'll just very quickly, and we can talk about it more later if people want, what Yusuf is referring to. There are folks who talk about Biden coming in and rolling a lot of stuff back. Most of the legislation people talk about rolling back is pre-Trump. And that's, I think, really important for folks who are, it's like my friends in Israel who want to hold Bibi responsible for all the ills in Israel, which is convenient. Trump is not responsible for all the problems in US policy on Israel-Palestine. To the extent that people want to see Biden roll things back, reopening the PLO mission to Washington is going to be limited. It's limited by ATCA that did under this administration, but it's also limited by the Anti-Terror Act of 1987, right? That's got to be dealt with. The ability to restart aid to the Palestinians, that's the Taylor Force Act. Again, that's bipartisan. You have all the different pieces. There is going to be a tremendous challenge if Biden wins and wants to demonstrate a different face by rolling back policy. He's going to be challenged by the laws that are in place. And the last thing I will say here, if there's anything to take even a tiny bit of hope from, I would say that it is in the Biden campaign or the platform, which did at least give a nod to free speech, which is something that we hadn't seen before. And for folks who watch this closely, that nod is about the things I'm talking about. It is about free speech critical of Israel. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. I want to turn now to Zaha, who I know has been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking about what the potential policy options and opportunities are for whoever comes to be inaugurated in January of next year, and on Israel-Palestine policy. So Zaha, I'd really love to hear from you about what we might expect in terms of policy from a Biden administration, or if we have another 4 years of Trump, what more might a Trump administration in the second term do on Israel-Palestine? And critically, how might the Palestinian leadership react to these different approaches in the next 4 years?
Thanks, Yusuf. And thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me today to be among this really wonderful panel. I'm going to apologize because I'm going to fidget a little bit because I just got this new stand-up desk and I shouldn't have used it today, but I did. And so now I'm trying to get used to standing while working. So anyway, I feel a little bit of deja vu today because I think it was 2016 that I was sitting on a panel with Shibli, and you were moderating, Yusuf, and the subject was what to expect about a Donald Trump presidency, or what we could expect from a President Hillary Clinton. That felt like an important election back then, and we didn't know much about what a Donald Trump foreign policy would look like. I don't think he did either. But we do know a lot about, Trump today, and we have almost 5 decades of history with Joe Biden in government. So we are on a bit of firmer footing to predict some things today. So what do I think? First, I want to address the question of whether if there is a big difference between Trump and Biden on foreign policy toward Palestine, Israel, and because I think there is a sense for many of those for whom, U.S. foreign policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an important issue, that there is little difference between one administration and another. And there is some truth to that, but we are in a very different place today, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And then after that, I'll address what exactly we can expect from a second term of a Trump administration and a first term Biden administration, and I'll flag some things I think we all should be watching out for. On whether there is a difference between Trump and Biden on Israel-Palestine, I will shock some viewers by saying emphatically, absolutely. And that if you care about human rights and human dignity for all people in the region, then you need to understand that difference from which is not so much one of policy, as Rashid said, but more on principles. Think about it like this. Palestinian freedom and rights is a scrawny but scrappy featherweight fighter that is used to fighting in a traditional boxing ring, which is the rules-based international order. It gets punched around a lot by the heavyweight champion of the world in that ring, which is US policy, but it knows how to float like a butterfly, and it can, rope-a-dope when it has to. Well, for the last 3 years, Palestine has been in the ring with an extreme fighter who was hiding a switchblade in his shorts. I mean, US policy was hitting below the belt, kicking Palestine when it's already down, and US policy has not respected the bell to end the round, but instead took out the knife and used it mercilessly. I believe a Biden administration will not be an end of the match between US policy and Palestinian freedom and rights, not at all. But it will be an entirely new match, and one which, Palestinians won't get hit below the belt, won't be kicked when they are down, and the US will respect the rules of the ring. That's because the Biden team has made clear that US foreign policy will center values, respect international legitimacy, and uphold a rules-based order. And we should not underestimate the importance of that. The situation has never been more precarious for Palestinians than this moment. And on top of, the challenges of living under occupation, under threat of displacement, or as a stateless person in an Arab country hosting Palestinian refugees, there is a global, pandemic raging. And Palestinians need a reprieve from the last, 4 years. They need time to regroup their movement, rebuild their institutions, develop a strategy to deal with the changing geopolitical landscape. They can see them through this moment. And they need to hear that bell at regular intervals so that they can rest and have the mind space to regroup. So what do I expect about a second term Trump? I mean, we can expect more of the same. I'm not going to be really a novel here, but what do we know? What we do know about Trump policy is might makes right. And if you don't have something of value to trade with President Trump, one that benefits him personally or politically, then you don't matter. So gifts to Israel that help Trump rejuvenate support from his base, Palestinians have been the red meat. But what could possibly be left to give the base, even if that base really isn't asking for it, as Shibley noted in his keynote? Well, I think a second-term Trump administration will likely continue to squeeze Palestinians financially. The U.S. will, influence third states to not give money to the PA, as it has done with countries like Saudi Arabia that used to give the PA budgetary support, $20 million a month. That hasn't happened since March. Trump administration will maintain the cut on UNRWA and encourage other countries to not contribute. And it will block appropriations that, Congress may make and put holds on appropriation. And I think a Trump administration will be, in the market for a new Palestinian leadership. It still wants to be able to say that, its plan, was serious. And so it wants a Palestinian on the other side of the table. So it'll be looking out for that. And we're already seeing some congressional efforts to delegitimize PA or Fatah officials and, individuals, we're not talking about the organization, coming into the U.S. because, they are, according to Congress, supporters of or financiers or financial supporters of terrorism because of the support for families of those who've been victims of political violence or those in prison. So we'll also see Trump continue with the normalization with Israel and influence third states to do so. So you can expect to see more, goodies put out there for countries like more commercial arms sales and other things like with Sudan, removing it from the state sponsor of terrorism list, those kinds of things. You'll also see efforts to normalize settlements with things and to integrate settlements into the region through economic endeavors and projects, joint projects that would involve, Arab Gulf states perhaps and others engaged in projects with, settlement enterprises or settlers that are operating in the West Bank. You'll see, BDS delegitimization at home and abroad by equating it with it and anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. There'll be more of an active effort internationally on that. You'll also see an effort by the Trump administration to link differentiation with BDS and try to discourage those who are interested in taking more serious measures around differentiation to think twice, because they will be labeled with this anti-Semitism label. On Jerusalem, I think you'll see a US that will support Israeli efforts and provide political cover for the de-Palestinianization of the city, besides, supporting Israel or just, providing political cover for things like home evictions and land confiscations. You'll see like support for these, archaeological endeavors and the, eviction of Palestinian cultural entities from the city. Now we go to the Biden administration, or possible Biden administration. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but here's what the Biden campaign has been saying and laying out in various planks that they've put up, to the Jewish community, the Arab American community, and the Muslim American community, and also what campaign advisors and Biden himself has said publicly. I mean, for Palestinians, I agree with Shibli in his keynote. There will be no grand gestures or initiatives here. You'll continue to hear support and a commitment to the two-state solution, but I would point out that, the references to a viable state of Palestine, viable state of Palestine, there's no reference to sovereignty or contiguity that we've seen in the past. And there's this idea that there should be, Palestinians, and Israel should have mutual recognition of their, as a predicate to this. And, for Palestinians, that means recognizing Israel as a Jewish state and as a homeland of the Jewish people. And this is after we've had, in 2018, a quasi-constitutional law in Israel passed that says only Jews are entitled to self-determination anywhere where Israel extends its sovereignty. So, and we've had the, looming de jure annexation. So, but yet still Palestinians need to recognize a borderless Israel before they can, have negotiations, need to recognize Israel as a state, for Jews and a national homeland for Jews. So, that's still on the, that's still on the table. We hear about a Biden administration, opposing annexation and opposing settlement expansion, but we also have heard very clearly that there will be no conditioning of aid to prevent that. So we don't really know what that opposition would look like beyond, public statements or maybe quiet urgings not to annex, not to extend settlements. We've also heard about restoring economic assistance and humanitarian assistance. Laura's talked about some of the, obstacles related to that. And we've also heard about, a focus on Gaza, the Gaza crisis. Does that mean, there's going to be support for lifting the blockade? I don't think so. I think it'll be more of, just trying to get more aid in and rebuild some infrastructure. And we've also heard about reopening the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem and reopening a PLO mission in Washington. Laura again has talked about there's legislative obstacles there as well. An executive and the executive branch is separate from the legislative branch. There's things that a president could do under his executive or her executive authority there, but I just don't see that political capital being expended on that fight. Now for Israel, we've heard about opposition and rejection of BDS, but as Laura pointed out, there's this free speech guarantee that there is going to be protection for free speech. But then what is that opposition and rejection of BDS going to look like? We don't know. And how do you reconcile support for free speech while condemning those who engage in it? So I don't, maybe that's all it is, but we don't know much about that. And then we've heard about maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. This gets complicated now because of this new vogue thing that's happened where, if you normalize with Israel, you'll be offered weapon systems, which then means Israel needs to get better weapon systems because it needs to keep its qualitative military edge. So, are we going to go ahead and keep, offering this kind of incentive for Arab regimes with terrible human rights records and repressive tactics internally to encourage them to normalize with Israel this way? This is actually one of the items on that Biden has indicated he will continue to support, which is bold efforts to encourage Arab states to normalize with Israel. So that's something we need to pay attention to moving forward, is how is that going to work given the UAE precedent at this point? And what's it going to mean for human rights in the region and a foreign policy that is value-based? And that's what the Biden campaign has talked about. And then there's also this promise to protect Israel in international fora and to re-engage in international mechanisms that the US has withdrawn from for the purpose of protecting Israel. So how do you square that with this platform that is looking to restore, international legitimacy and restore a rules-based order if you're going to use your power and influence in those mechanisms to prevent the application of law? So there's a lot of, things that remain to be seen about the policy and how do you reconcile a lot of these things. So quickly, what will Palestinians do? Well, if past is prologue, then the national movement is in trouble because Palestinian leadership has been paralyzed by disunity and consumed by its own self-preservation. The Gaza, Hamas, and Fatah West Bank split has prevented a serious conversation to move forward on the Palestinian political program. But there are some hopeful signs, however, and that things might be changing in this regard. There's been a unified leadership dialogue that has begun. Hamas and Fatah came to an agreement in Istanbul on elections. The Palestinian president has agreed to change the election laws so that Hamas candidates in PA elections don't have to swear, a commitment to the PLO before, running. That law was put in place by decree after Hamas won the 2006 elections, and it's prevented an agreement between Hamas and Fatah on holding elections. But now Abbas has indicated he's willing to reverse that. But then there's a sticking point of holding elections in Jerusalem, which President Abbas has said in the past that is absolutely necessary. So we'll see how that works out. I mean, Israel does not want to see a unity between Fatah and Hamas. That would impede its separation policy with respect to Gaza. And the urgency of Hamas towards reconciliation is not as strong today as it had been in the past because Israel's been allowing Qatar to bring in financial support into the Strip. So, this is all very contingent, and we just don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, what should Palestinians be focusing on? I mean, I personally don't think elections is the priority, particularly not PA elections right now. It doesn't make sense since the PA itself needs to be rethought, and also the elections will get bogged down in all of these details, and there will be fights and battles between Hamas and Fatah. There's some, ideas about how to resolve those battles, like creating a joint list between Fatah and Hamas, but it's just going to be a really long struggle. I think the focus should be on institutionalizing the unified leadership dialogue and continuing with that mechanism to resolve issues and start having conversations about what exactly should be Palestinian priorities, how to get to understanding about where the political platform should go. And reconsider the two-state solution, and figure out how to deal with annexation, whether to withdraw now from past agreements that recognized Israel. If there is no purpose behind the PA, what is its purpose, and how to respond to the geopolitical changes and the normalization that's taking place around them. I mean, there's so much to talk about, including the COVID-19 response measures. So to me, that's much more of a priority than talking about PA elections when you don't even know if PA has got any, purpose at this point. So that, in a nutshell, is what I have to offer.
Thank you for all that, Zaha. I want to now turn it over to Peter. Peter, I know that one of the topics that you write and think about a lot is the American Jewish community and sort of where they are on this issue. Obviously the last 4 years, the Trump years, have been quite a moment for the American Jewish community, one where we've seen this remarkable rise in anti-Semitism, and at the same time quite a profound embrace between the President of the United States, who is fomenting a lot of this anti-Semitic attitudes, and at the same time being validated by the Prime Minister of Israel as the greatest friend of the Jewish people. So I'm wondering sort of from you, what sort of shifts you've seen in the American Jewish community over this time, how it's sort of evolving, what shifts you think are important, and what impact an election outcome in either direction will have on those shifts that we've seen in recent years.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with such a wonderful group of people who I admire so much, these my fellow panelists. I think that the macro story, I think, in the among American Jews, I would just parenthetically say that even the terminology is very problematic. The macro story is a story of a collapse of a center and polarization. And one of the ways you could understand that is actually terminologically, which is that there's a split between American Jews and Jewish Americans, which is to say, is America the adjective that defines the noun of being Jewish, right? And or is Jewish the adjective that defines the noun of being American? That's kind of one way of thinking about two completely different perspectives that exist in terms of what it means to be Jewish in the United States. One way of understanding, I think, this kind of collapse is to think about what the center is. And if you think about the people who have historically populated AIPAC, they are people who are fairly secular, but highly affiliated. I call them in my book secular tribalists. They're not religiously observant Jews, but they're people who, in a way, have substituted a form of Jewish nationalism for traditional religious observance. They generally belong to conservative or reform, but not Orthodox synagogues. And they're generally moderate Democrats who have not radically left, but moderately progressive views on domestic policy, and yet kind of code switch, put on a different set of lens when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and basically on Israel-Palestine, instead of being progressive, they are kind of security-oriented and nationalistic. Now, this center is clearly in decline. One of the reasons, and so what you see is growth on both the left and the right. Right? It's easier for us, it's more favorable to us to think about only the growth to the left of this, but there's also a lot of growth to the right of this. Why is this center collapsing, and why do we see growth on both its left and right? The first is religious change. There's a strong correlation between people's religious commitments and their political affiliations among Jews, just as there are among many other Americans, particularly white Americans, right? We know that white Protestants and Catholics who go to church more are more likely to be Republican. Those who go to church less are less likely to be, more likely to be Democrat. It's not that different with Jews. The Jewish center has been essentially people who are affiliated with conservative and reform synagogues. Those numbers are in steep decline. The conservative movement, which was the center religiously and culturally of American Jewish life in the middle of the 20th century, is in free fall. What you see is growth among non-affiliated Jews, right, who have affiliated with no religious group, and you see dramatic growth in the Orthodox community. Right? And you see essentially, so you've got one group that is highly universalistic and one group that is highly tribal. And so as the religious center collapses, it's not surprising that the political center, which is, again, as I say, kind of moderate Democrats who support groups like AIPAC, who talk about believing in the two-state solution, but wouldn't ever do anything to actually support it, that center is collapsing. The other reason the center is collapsing is because of generational change. It's not a secret that across a wide array of issues in the United States, there are massive generational divides. And this is true among American Jews as well. But it's important there's an important caveat here. We talk about how younger American Jews are more progressive on Israel, as on virtually everything else, than their parents and grandparents. Absolutely true. It's also important to remember, though, that Orthodox Jews are a significantly higher percentage of millennial and Gen Z Jews than they are of Jews who are in their 50s or 60s or 70s and 80s, right? You have Orthodox Jews get married earlier, they have more kids, they affiliate as Jews in much stronger numbers, their intermarriage rates are much lower, right? So Orthodox Jews in the younger generation, even though they're a minority, punch way above their weight. And so if you go to an AIPAC meeting, one of the things you notice, it's worth going to an AIPAC meeting and just looking for at which of the men are wearing kippot, right? Or yarmulkes, right? What you see is of the men over the age of 50, it's a fairly small minority. Of the men under the age of, let's say, 40 or certainly 30, it's probably a majority. Right? So what is essentially happening in the organized American Jewish community, certainly a group like AIPAC, is the secular tribalists, their children may not be interested because their children may be secular universalists who are either more progressive on Israel-Palestine or frankly just don't care very much because they're not really that connected to Israel-Palestine or frankly to that much Jewish at all. But they do have another generation that can replace their children. And that generation is coming out of the Orthodox community. Just go, if you go to an Orthodox day school anywhere in the United States, or even a pluralistic day school like the one my kids attend, you walk in and you see a clock which has the time in the city that you're living in and it has the time in Jerusalem, right? That these are kids who are going to spend a year in yeshiva after they graduate. This is a highly, highly Zionistic environment. You go to look at the Israel Day Parade in New York City. It's entirely dominated by the Orthodox community and by vast numbers of kids from Orthodox Jewish day schools. So that's the future. And that future is further right than where AIPAC is, partly because the Orthodox community is very ensconced in the Republican Party, right? If you're a Jew who's not Orthodox, you're likely to live in a community where people think that to be Republican means you're not really maybe a very good Jew, right? If you're in the Orthodox community, you may very well live in a community where you think to be a Democrat means you're not a very good Jew. It is a completely bifurcated partisan notion. And so, someone like Jared Kushner, right? There are many, 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 many Jared Kushners coming, right? Given his particular constellation of religious and political affiliations. That is not going away. There's going to be a lot of that. In general, I think you can say that there's a roughly 50-50 split on the question of basically, if you ask the question basically, if the question is, do you really care about Palestinian rights at all? Do you want the United States to be more supportive of Palestinian rights than it is now? You probably have a roughly 50-50 split among American Jews on that question. If you want to say kind of the J Street position versus the AIPAC position. And of course, there are some people to the left even of J Street. The problem is that as we know in America, numbers do not determine political power. There are a lot of other factors that determine political power. Older people have more political power than younger people. People with money have more political power than, look how much power Sheldon Adelson has, right? You can give me, you give me 50,000 young lefty Jewish kids, right? They probably don't have as much power as one Sheldon Adelson does. This isn't only true among Jews. Look at Cubans, right? You see that the more conservative element of the Cuban American community, which is the older generation, is still politically overrepresented. It's partly because of money. It's also because it's more institutionalized. If you're a member of a synagogue or a member of some kind of Jewish organization, you have an institution from which to play politics and to get to know your member of Congress and to start to give money and to have all those networks. Yes, that exists with J Street. It even exists a little bit with Jewish Voices for Peace, but generally, the more conservative Jews are much more institutionalized in the Jewish community, and therefore it gives them a greater avenue to have access and connection with politicians. There's also this kind of weird irony, which is to say, the divide is basically between tribalists and universalists, essentially, right? And essentially, it's not surprising because Judaism itself is all about the tension between universalism and tribalism. But the irony is the very universalism that makes younger, more left Jewish Americans care about Palestinians, see them as human beings who deserve rights, also makes them care less about the whole issue. Because if you are, the more universalistic you get, if you sit in Westchester or California, the more you're likely to say, yeah, maybe what Israel's doing is pretty bad, but goodness, my moral universal commitments are so spread out given what's happening in the world today. Climate change, right? If I go to speak at a college campus to young non-Orthodox Jewish college students, the biggest challenge for me is not to convince them not to be against what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing. It's to convince them to care about this issue rather than climate change. I think it's different often among Palestinian Americans for whom their own family story is so deeply intertwined with this, what their parents went through, when their grandparents went through. But for Jews who've been in the United States for 100 years, for whom Israel is a pretty abstract question, oftentimes they just disassociate because their very universalism leads them not to prioritize this issue over anything else. And of course, particularly at a time when the United States and its democracy are in such peril, it's obviously easier for them to naturally focus on things here. So in an ironic kind of way, the young Jewish Americans who are most engaged and in whom I have the most hope to change this debate are not the most universalistic ones. They tend to be the ones who come from more strongly affiliated Jewish backgrounds, whether because they went to Jewish day school or Jewish day camp or something. And yet then they have some experience, often a personal experience with Palestinians, that essentially allows them to try to fuse universalism, tribalism in a way in which they say the honor of that I feel as a Jew some sense of shame or guilt or moral responsibility, or my honor is at stake. If you don't have that sense of that you are part of the Jewish story, in a funny way, it actually makes you less willing to engage and fight for Palestinian rights. So I'll stop there, and I'm just happy to talk about whatever folks want to talk about.
Thank you for that, Peter. It was really fascinating. I want to we're gonna move now to a couple questions that I have for each of you, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience online. And just to remind you all, if you want to send in your questions, if you have not already, you can do that through the Q&A feature here in the Zoom program, or by sending them via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. So get them in the queue if you've not done so already. Peter, I want to stick with you and get you to talk about this bit a little bit more. You wrote in your piece in Jewish Currents earlier this year, you made an argument for moving in a different direction toward a single state with equal rights for Israel and Palestine. This piece was published right after the sort of anticipated official Israeli annexation announcement that never materialized. Instead, what we've seen in recent months is these normalization agreements, including one with the UAE, which they sought to frame as sort of an effort to stave off annexation. How much do you think these dynamics will impact the traction of your argument with an American Jewish audience?
I think ultimately not really that much. I mean, I think that if you look at, I think what people, what the mainstream kind of establishment Jewish discourse is, well, now we know that nobody cares about the Palestinians, right? Not even the Arab governments care about the Palestinians. So the Palestinians essentially should accept whatever they're given, right? That's the underlying notion, right? Whatever crumbs they're given, they need to accept. And I think the implication is, I think there's also an unstated assumption that essentially Israel can do whatever it wants to the Palestinians with even more impunity than it's had before. So I think those are kind of underlying kind of notions. But the reality is that it's not the Gulf monarchies that have the ability to speak to people around the world, including Americans, including younger Jewish Americans, and galvanize them around a moral vision, right? I mean, goodness knows, those are the last people on earth who could do that, right? The people who can do that are Palestinians who speak, in the long tradition of peoples who have been denied basic rights and speak in the language of justice and the language of love, and again, I mean, if you look at the reception, you put Ayman Odeh in front of Jewish audiences, even remotely progressive audiences, and you see the power of a Palestinian vision of equality to speak to Americans, including at least a big cross of a lot of younger American Jews. I think you see the possibility of that, and so I think that this. When that, to the degree that that emerges, I think that will capture the imagination of people, and ultimately, in the end of the day, that we could get to a situation where you have a kind of, yes, congratulations, you now have a kind of Jewish Arab kind of coalition for authoritarianism, and for tyranny. Congratulations, very ecumenical of you. What we need on the other side is a Jewish, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, go on and on and on, coalition of people who believe in justice and equality. And I think in some ways that would be a nice argument to have.
Thanks, Peter, for that. Rashid, I want to sort of turn to you with this next question, continuing on this theme of responding to the normalization announcements that we've seen in recent weeks. There was an article in The Economist recently that argued, as it was titled, that the Arab-Israeli conflict is fading. And I'm wondering, as a historian who has written and documented this conflict for so many years, how you react to the idea that the Arab-Israeli conflict is ending.
Let me just add something to what Peter said. That coalition has to also talk about democracy, because it's not just justice and equality. Those are the key things, but it has to talk about democracy. The most absolute monarchies on earth are the ones that just made agreements with Israel, one of which was installed by Saudi troops after its people almost overthrew it in Bahrain, or reinstalled. And that is a requirement. I mean, when the PLO actually had some purchase in the Arab world, it was aligned with progressive forces, or what were then appeared in the 60s to be progressive forces that were in favor of justice and equality and democracy. And that has to be the approach going forward. You're obliged to deal with governments, you deal with them, but you go over their heads to their peoples. And there is a huge thirst for democracy in the Arab world. Not just 2011, 2012, but what has happened up until COVID shut it down in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Lebanon, shows that that's the case. And you have to align yourself with those forces on a Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, whatever basis. But to speak to the question you asked me, Yusuf, in certain respects, the Arab-Israeli conflict as a state-to-state conflict has been over since Egypt and Jordan signed peace treaties. There remains the issue of the Golan Heights. There is an Arab-Israeli, i.e. a state-to-state conflict over the status of the Golan Heights, leaving aside Lebanon and the Shebaa farms, which we could talk about. The issue is between Palestinians and Israelis over the status of Palestine. That's the conflict. And in fact, the Fahd plan of 2002 more or less accepts that. It says, we're ready to make peace with you. Just deal with the Palestinians and we're done. The Arab states basically said, we have no conflict with you. Even Syria signed on to that. Obviously, they wanted the Golan Heights back and have the right to have it back. But aside from that issue, there is no state-to-state Arab-Israeli conflict. Egypt and Israel have a border that has been adjudicated by peace treaty. So do Jordan and Israel. The Lebanese border, with the exception of Shebaa farms, is not really an issue. So besides Syria, the question is, what is the status of the Palestinian people? What is the status of Palestine? What is the status of Israel or Israelis? And that's the conflict. It's gone back, as I argue in my book, to its settler colonial roots. The state-to-state aspect that came in 1948 more or less has been ended. So I am not, I'm not somebody who says no. This is still a core issue for Arab states. It's not a core issue for Arab states. Now, Israel's intervention in the Arab world is something that I think people should be very deeply concerned about. The kind of alliances it makes with the worst regimes on earth in terms of repression of their own people, in terms of completely operating on a basis opposite the consent of the governed. That should be a matter of concern. The fact that you have these kinds of alliances and the fact that Israel is directly involving itself in all kinds of, that should be a matter of concern on a state-to-state basis. But that's not the core of the conflict. There are issues with Turkey, there are issues with Iran. The big nation states in the Middle East are pushing other people around, and the Arab states are a mess. That's another issue. And Israel is a big problem in that regard. But the real issue is the institutional discrimination that Israel represents insofar as the Palestinians are concerned. It represents the denial of Palestinian rights, not just self-determination, almost any rights. They have no political rights. You don't have the right to your property if you're Palestinian, okay? If you had property in Poland and it was stolen from you by the Nazis, you have a right to it. If you're a Palestinian and it was stolen from you, and you do not have that right. If you were forced to leave your home in 1948, or your grandfather or your grandmother was, you don't have the right to return. So those issues of rights, that's the conflict. That's where the conflict is. How it's adjudicated is another matter. And the fact that Arab public opinion is actually rather supportive of the Palestinians on this. The Arab Center has done wonderful polling on this. And it's shown consistently over the years that in the 12 countries that were polled, or 11 countries that were polling took place, including some of the Gulf countries, public opinion in the Arab world hasn't changed one bit. It's very resentful of the idea of normalization with Israel, as long as Israel continues to treat the Palestinians in the awful way that it does treat them. What has changed is that Arab governments, undemocratic, repressive, afraid of their own people, kleptocracies that steal the wealth of their societies and are protected by the Western countries that are benefiting from that wealth, are willing to deal with Israel because Israel will protect them as well, just as the United States has protected these kinds of regimes. So is Israel perfectly willing to step in and do that. And that's why the opposition should be on the basis not just of rights and equality, but also of democracy.
Thanks very much, Rashid. Zaha, I know that in your comments, you sort of minimize the importance of elections for Palestinians, at least PA elections, as being super important in the immediate short term. But I have to ask you, this November, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, turns 85 years old. This summer, there was something of a rare conference that brought together Palestinian factions from both Ramallah and Beirut as normalization announcements started to take place. There's renewed talk of elections now for the PLC, the presidency, and more. We've heard all this before. Is the Arab normalization announcements a reason to take the election talk among Palestinians more seriously this time? And how do you think the shifts in Arab positions impact Palestinian domestic politics at all?
Yeah, I think it's definitely more serious this time, but I don't think the complicating factors have changed at all. So I'm not really so hopeful about the PA elections. And like I said, I just, at a time when, the Palestine Central Council has, for many years now, called for, the derecognition of Israel and the termination of the Oslo agreements, and to rethink the PA. And this is also very widely supported by Palestinians. Why start with legislative elections to this body when it didn't end so well last time anyway for Palestinian democracy? So yes, revitalizing the PLO should be the priority, but how to get there? The PLO process of electing people it's not elections anyway. It's a quota system that's very antiquated. And to talk about going straight to PNC elections, the parliament of the PLO, is also problematic because if you look at who's how they did the PNC elections last time, just a few years ago, a couple years ago now, there was people were not happy with how it went down because it wasn't very transparent. No one really understood who was, how the quota was being worked out and why certain, factions that are really non-existent. There might be a few people left, on some of these factions, or some of these bodies were still, still having this kind of representation in the PNC. So the idea really should be to focus on sitting down and having, a conversation between the Hamas and Fatah and the other factions, and civil society as well should be brought in to talk about, how do we really have a representative PLO? What should it look like, in 2020? We're not in, 1965 anymore. So let's talk about what that should look like. And that's not where the focus is right now. And that's concerning to me because, it doesn't bode well for the way this is all going to end if the focus starts with legislative elections, and in particular because we know what the Palestinian leadership has said about holding elections in Jerusalem, and that you're not going to get an Israeli government that's going to be willing to comply with past modalities for elections in Jerusalem. There would have to be some compromise on that, and so it just remains to be seen. In terms of the leadership and where is that going, it's hard to say really. It's going to be a Fatah nomination process, and there will be a transfer of authority, but it will be internal to Fatah, the Central Council or Central Committee, and it's similar to what happened when Yasser Arafat passed away. So there's a lot of work to do inside Palestinian internally, and with respect to the PLO, as I said, I don't see the PA as being quite the priority now.
Thank you, Zaha. Laura, last question for you here before we turn to the questions from the audience. One of the interesting sort of dynamics that we saw after the 2016 election is that the election of Donald Trump provided a much clearer contrast, right? Particularly for those who may have been on the fence on this issue, and it sort of allowed for more space, particularly among progressives in Congress, to start taking more steps towards legislative action of one form or another. What sort of impact do you think a Biden election, let's say, a Biden win in the election might have on Congress and the space there to continue doing this type of work, particularly if the Biden approach is one that says, we are going to sort of repair the relationship between Israel and Democrats that has been so fraught in recent years?
Thanks, Yusuf. It's interesting framing. Look, candidly, I think if there's going to be a shift in Congress, the bigger shift is going to come from a change in the composition of Congress and members who are elected directly, who are responsible to their constituents, and who are coming to Congress either recently elected with a clear statement from their grassroots as part of their election about where they have room to maneuver on Israel-Palestine and are more progressive, and how much of a sort of shot in the arm they give to fellow progressives in Congress who maybe haven't tested this the same way with their grassroots, but are more progressive and want to move there. And I will say, as someone who's worked, wandered the halls of Congress for many a year, for decades, you walk into somebody's office, you close the door, and the member of Congress says to you, I want to be more progressive. I'm really frustrated about Israel. I support the Palestinians on this. This is terrible. I'm not anti-Israel, but I can't support this. They say, but I can't say that publicly or I'll get just destroyed. It would be interesting to see in a new, particularly a House, how that shifts. How much could be impacted by a Biden presidency, if say a Biden presidency, and by the way, it's not just the Biden presidency, it depends what happens in Israel, right? Because if you continue to have essentially the Bibi dynasty in place or something to the right of Bibi, I mean, it doesn't, I think it's less important what happens in the White House here. You know, members are reacting to an Israeli government that is openly embracing a liberalism and is actively making common cause with the liberals around the world, including the Trump administration, right? You know, if you get into a position where you have a Biden presidency trying to figure out how it doesn't clash with a Bibi or a Bennett government, I don't see how that's going to move us. I could see it being very problematic, and I could see Congress outflanking a president on progressive values right there. I think that's going to be a real problem for a Biden presidency if he's elected. Fundamentally, I think the most important thing here is where we started today, which is Shibli, and which is looking at where Americans are and trying to understand how those sort of almost subterranean shifts in the electorate are gradually going to be felt on the surface of the sea. Okay, I'm mixing my metaphors, but you get what I'm saying. I think that is less dependent on Biden. I do think it's very clear the old guard in Congress would love to see Biden in power and moving back to an Obama era pro-peace policy that they call pro-peace that they're comfortable with, which articulates comfortable. I talk about like wrapping yourself in the cloak of the two-state, Oslo process. That cloak is in tatters. They can wrap themselves around with it again, but it's in tatters. And unless someone's going to reweave it and give it some substance, it doesn't matter.
Thank you, Laura. We're going to move now to our questions from the audience. I'm going to direct this first one to Peter. I know Peter has to leave us a little bit early, but I was hoping we can get a question into him first. And this question comes from Steve France, who is watching online. Peter, how much might supporters of establishing, a single state with equal rights, how might they advance their cause in the U.S. in this moment?
I mean, the conversation, once the conversation becomes legitimized in more mainstream American political spaces, and including in Jewish spaces, I think it will have a lot of resonance. I mean, after all, just think of we are, think about the way what people want in the United States, right? We have a vision of progressives want essentially a secular government where everyone lives under the same law. We don't really. It would be more natural, perhaps, from people from other countries to perhaps think about partitioning and having kind of two ethno-religious states side by side. But at least for progressive Americans, that's not our tradition. That's not our vision, right? So, in a way, it's not a hard case to make, right? I mean, you basically just say to someone, listen, why don't we just try to make it like what we want for the United States, It's what you have to, and I think that will come. We just don't have, even Bernie Sanders, or let's say, hasn't been willing to actually go out and say that. He's kind of hinted at it. There are not a lot of politicians who kind of, especially given that the nominal Palestinian leadership is not taking that position. It's a little bit, in some ways, a little difficult to be kind of more Catholic than the Pope. But I do think, that if we saw a Palestinian leadership move in that direction, I think we would see more of a move in that space. And there's, as Laura was saying, there are already lots of people, as you all know, who say this kind of privately, right? I think part of the work in the Jewish community, which I've, tried to do a little bit, how successfully, who knows, but is to try to challenge the almost unconscious, kind of automatic move that exists among many American Jews that essentially one equal state means either Jews fleeing for their lives or Jews just not even making it out with their lives, right? That it has a kind of almost genocidal connotations. It's crazy in a lot of ways, but again, it comes from a deep trauma, and it comes from a trauma that's been very effectively exploited for a very, very long time. And that's why I think it's really, really important for us to have people coming out and talking about, as you did, Yusuf, in your piece in Foreign Affairs, about how one state would work and about how one state could have protections. And then we need people who know something, who can actually respond to the immediate kind of vague, generalized racist responses you get. Well, there's nowhere in the Arab world where Jews, or for that matter, Christians, could ever live safely. Look at Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? You need people who can actually enter those conversations. Most of the people who are saying those things don't actually really know very much about what's happening in the rest of the Arab world or the reason that Lebanon has evolved, right? But you need people who can enter into that conversation. I think it'll come, we're just not there yet.
Thanks very much, Peter. Our next question here comes from Melinda Smith. It's not directed to anyone in particular, but the question is, what issues and strategies, legislative, protest, etc., do you think should be prioritized for Palestinian or activists for Palestinian rights? And then goes on to name some of the organizations doing that work, Jewish Voices for Peace, If Not Now, and the Friends Service Committee, and so on. Anyone want to take a stab at responding to that one?
I'll jump in just very quickly. And I think we should also mention there are Palestinian organizations. Those are basically Jewish and one Quaker one. There's a whole range of Palestinian organizations, most notably SJP. Look, I think that there's the question of defense and offense, and to some degree these are mixing, but both Zaha and I have mentioned the battle. I would suggest that the battle going forward is as much a domestic battle as it is a battle for Palestinian rights on the ground, because those have now come together in the United States. The conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and the effort to essentially turn that into an artifact of US law and apply it across the board is going to come back and hit everybody. I would be remiss to not say people need to watch this in Congress. They need to watch the targeting of social media in particular. And nobody at this weird moment in time with anti-Semitism and white supremacy and Nazism and all that surging should be downplaying the need to fight anti-Semitism. But nobody should miss the fact that there is a quiet and extremely energetic effort to wrap criticism of Israel and support for the Palestinians into that battle, and essentially use it as the knockout punch to say that pretty much everything we do and say, and I say this as a Jew, is anti-Semitic and must be quashed. The BDS piece as well, there are efforts now to equate personal boycotts of Israel or settlements with illegal coerced boycotts of Israel under US, which are illegal under US law. There's efforts to conflate the BDS movement or support for BDS with support for terrorism, right? And bring in RICO and other things. The effort to weaponize what I call 6 degrees of terrorist contamination, where people say, I have someone who's vaguely affiliated with the PFLP, and that means this organization many degrees away is a terrorist organization. This was the main effort to go after McCollum for her bill on Palestinian children living under occupation, was to argue that a highly respected human rights organization is effectively an arm of a terrorist organization because of the 6 degrees of contamination. So fighting for our own rights as Americans at this point has become part of is interwoven with the battle for Palestinian rights writ large.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in, Yusuf?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
I want to build on what Lara said, with which I fully agree. I think that if people want to know what they can do, there are institutions fighting these attempts to shut down the First Amendment where Israel is concerned, to prevent us from speaking, essentially, to say anything we say is a violation of US law, anti-discrimination law, and is anti-Semitic. You're beyond the pale, you're inhuman, you're an anti-Semite, and you've broken the law, and we're going to go after you with the full force of the law. There are institutions that are fighting this. The Center for Constitutional Rights. People want to do something, support the Center for Constitutional Rights. It is bringing legal, you need to bring, there are battalions of lawyers, privately funded, who are bringing meretricious, baseless cases against students, academics, organizations. The US campaign is the subject of one of these idiotic, completely baseless, meretricious, as you put it, 6 degrees of separation cases. Center for Constitutional Rights is fighting, and others are fighting that. People really should pay a lot of attention to the legal aspects of this. On campus, where academics and students are targeted, harassed by administrations, harassed by off-campus organizations, harassed by these battalions of lawyers, hot and cold running lawyers. God knows how much they're billing and who's paying for it. I don't even want to know. Much of it seems to be directed at a distance from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel, and by Israeli groups and American groups together, operating together. Palestine Legal is fighting those cases. And there are other institutions besides CCR. ACLU is fighting these cases. These are vital to our freedom of speech as Americans. It's not just a matter of Palestinian rights. I mean, if they get away with this, especially in the kind of environment that Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party, the Republican Party, which is Trump's party right now, have created, these are incredibly dangerous for our freedoms as a whole, not just as far as Palestinian rights are concerned. The last thing I would say is that the efforts of groups like the Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voice for Peace, efforts in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanctions are things that I think we should all align ourselves with and support. The more people who show that they're not afraid, the greater, or let me put it differently, the less intimidation that these people who are trying to shut down our freedom of speech will be able to exercise. I mean, the kind of thing that Lara talked about in Congress, where Congress people would close the door and say, I'm terrified of these guys, but I really don't believe this. We're hoping that that barrier may begin to break down in Congress. They're trying to recreate that barrier on campus. They're trying to recreate that barrier for organizations. And I think that the more people who stand up and say, yes, we are in favor of this, and this is not anti-Semitic, and we will support with our voices, with our names, with our signatures, ideally with our money, the better.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. Thank you for that, Rashid, and thank you, Laura. I would just add to that point that this meme that we're seeing of trying to silence dissent by attacking civil society organizations, including those that are focused on human rights, is one that is proliferated across this axis of global authoritarianism. It's not, of course, just limited to Israel, but as recently as yesterday, we saw the news that Amnesty International has been forced to shut down in Modi's India, for example, because they've gone after their bank accounts and so on. So this is becoming sort of a device of those who want to crush dissent in a lot of different places. And on that theme, I want to sort of direct this question to you, Rashid. You had mentioned in some of your comments, the question comes from David Barrett. He says, I've seen a lot of commentary noting that the normalization deals don't reflect popular opinion among Arab people, but isn't it also true that manifestations of protest were virtually non-existent? Is it possible that he writes Saudi Emirati dominated media culture, message control, et cetera, and thought repression is genuinely increasing apathy towards the Palestinian cause? It almost feels, he says, as if international solidarity is more active than Arab and Islamic solidarity. So your reactions to that, Rashid?
That's actually a good question, and I think there's a point there. One of the problems is that the Arab world in general is in a parlous, terrible state. I mean, we have 4 countries, depending how you count it: Syria, to some extent Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, which are in states of civil war or war. And where the countries have been destroyed. In the case of Iraq, by American invasion and sanctions. In the case of Syria, by external intervention and civil war and regime repression. In the case of Yemen and Libya, in the wake of the 2011 revolutions that overthrew their dictatorial regimes. So 4 Arab countries are in a state of, they don't exist in effect, or they're very, very weak. And people are understandably obsessed with the fact that Iraq is collapsing or Syria is collapsing. If you're Syrian, the last thing you can worry about is Palestine. You have a problem in a third of the Syrian population are still refugees inside or outside of their country. That's your biggest concern. And they are dealing with repressive regimes in almost all parts of the Arab world. Yeah, in Kuwait, you have elections. In Lebanon, you have a failing democratic system. In Tunisia, they have a real democracy. But in most Arab countries, you have extraordinarily repressive regimes, which have perfected the methods of keeping public opinion under control. And even in those countries that have lost some of that control, like the Sudan and like Algeria, you have powerful militaries supported externally by billions of dollars in the case of the Sudanese military from the Gulf by these repressive monarchies that are playing the role in 2020 that St. Petersburg and Vienna played in crushing democracy in Europe in 1848. These guys are the capitals of black reaction, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, in the entire Arab world. And the regimes that are, the places like Algeria and Sudan, where there's real contestation, the military is being supported by these same regimes. And these regimes have bought up a large part, as the questioner suggests, of the Arab media. The great pan-Arab newspapers are owned by princes of these dynasties, using the wealth of their people to, buy up things. The major outlets, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya on cable TV, are owned again by Gulf potentates or by Gulf interests. So there is a problem in getting through. And I think there is a bit of weariness with the Palestine issue. And I think that there's an obsession, understandable obsession, with the problems that are closer to home in countries, whether they're oil producing countries where the price of oil has collapsed and the entire economic model has failed, or whether there are countries that are facing this terrible problem of repressive regimes. So for a variety of reasons, I think there is not as much Arab support as there could be and should be. But I think that again, I'm going to go back to the polling that's done by the Arab Center. The numbers are clear. 80-something% of people in the Arab world, according to those polls, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of people polled in person, feel that there should not be normalization with Israel until there's a just resolution of the Palestine question. That's what the Arabs feel. Their rulers are somewhere else.
Thanks so much, Rashid. And I think we have time for one more question here, and I want to direct it to Zaha. Do you see any way in which the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, could come up with a plan of its own? I think Rashid had suggested something like this in his initial comments, or a diplomatic initiative, perhaps in concert with Arab governments, to regenerate a diplomatic process. This question comes to us from Orinir.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that, during this Palestinian statehood bid, that was a rare moment in which, you had a thought through Palestinian strategy and a plan supported by different Arab governments to change the negotiating position, but also to push towards accountability for Palestinians. And there was a lot of energy around the statehood bid. That was between 2010 and 2012, both on the ground by the people, internationally, Palestinians and solidarity groups, and in various capitals around the world. There was an amazing support and amazing coordination between Palestinian diplomats and the foreign ministry, between different bodies within the PA, and that's very rare. There's a lot of dysfunction, as everyone might guess, associated with Palestinian governance. But at that moment, you saw a lot of cooperation, a lot of coordination, and a lot of support, by Palestinians for the initiative, even among those who were not supporters of the two-state solution. And it was because it was, you know, Palestinians showing they had agency, Palestinians, you know, pursuing mechanisms for accountability. So there is a potential for, you know, for that kind of energy to come back again. The problem that we have, though, is, and what happened to the Palestinian statehood, but is the minute you had, you know, the international community and the U.S. pushing for the relaunch of talks, you know, it was like, you know, the ringing of the bell for Pavlov's dogs. Palestinians went running for that opportunity to sit at a negotiating table, even though it was clear there wasn't going to be any movement on negotiations with, you know, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's tried and true in this regard. And so, you know, why they decided to throw away all that international goodwill to go into negotiations, knowing that it was going to be completely problematic for them to, you know, to do so. And you know, it's unfortunate, but that's the risk that's posed by these kind of diplomatic initiatives is, you know, that moment was lost. And there was a lot of negative feeling by members of the international community that were supporting Palestinians in the bid, because it was felt like, you know, you're not serious when you do these initiatives. They're really just a show. And, you know, we also expend some political capital supporting you in your initiative. You know, we also did a lot of work for you in terms of lobbying others to come on board. So again, you know, that can only be successful when you have, you know, a national dialogue first that looks at exactly what is your objective here. You know, what is the purpose behind this kind of international diplomatic initiative? Like, what are you trying to achieve? And are you in it for the long game, or are you in it just for, you know, this momentary victory, you know, to bolster your own leadership? So, I mean, you know, there's a sequence to this that has to happen first, but is the potential there? Yeah, the potential is there, but it just needs to be, you know, there needs to be the Palestinians getting their house in order first.
Thanks for that, Zaha, and I think we're going to have to leave it there for this panel. I really want to thank you all for participating, your truly incisive comments and presentations, and for everybody who tuned in and sent in their questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but there was a tremendous response. And thank you for joining us for the third and final day of Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s 5th annual conference, and for all the questions that came in over the various presentations. Our sincere thanks to our keynote speaker today, Shibli Talhami, and to our panel for their insights. Just a reminder that videos from the conference will be available on the ACW website at arabcenterdc.org. And for updates on publications and events, please follow ACW on Facebook and Twitter. And we look forward to having you with us at future events. So the last announcement that I do want to make, since we did mention it a good bit here, is that the Arab Opinion Index, the latest poll for 2019-2020, which you know, Rashid and others had mentioned regarding Arab opinion in the region, will be announced next week on October 6th and 7th. So please stay tuned for our new findings, which ACW will publicize starting next week. So thank you all, wishing you all well, and hope to see you again soon.